It's a great honor to be asked to preach this particular sermon at the end of Yom Kippur as we turn from facing inward and our innermost thoughts to looking outward to the rest of the world once again. So I want to quote one verse from this morning's Haftarah, which reads in Hebrew, Uvanu mimcha chorvot olam mosdei dor vador tekomen. Those from among you shall rebuild the old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, Goder Peretz, the restorer of paths in which to dwell. Now, that came from this morning's memorable Haftarah, which the Reform movement has adopted in a big way from Isaiah, about how we should fast and how to be decent human beings. And it has these memorable verses. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the homeless with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Quite clear then. Enough of the fasting, the rituals, the false promises, all for show. Instead, a life of doing the right thing, feeding the poor, freeing the prisoners, clothing the naked, and of course, acting responsibly to one's own family and tribe. But that particular phrase is the one that we need to remember. We're to be the Goder Peretz, the repairer of the breach, the ones whose responsibility it is to put things right in our broken society. That's our job. Now, given the theme of these high holy days is back to the future, looking to the past to build our future, it's worth thinking for a moment how our founders viewed being the Goder Peretz. First, look around you again after Rabbi Emily's sermon this morning. Look around again at this beautiful building. It was erected 30 years after the congregation's founding in 1840, and its opening made it into the Illustrated London News. This was a statement building to show the world that we had arrived. But who were we, and where had we arrived at? On one level, our founders, and some of their descendants are with us here today, were prosperous businessmen in the city and elsewhere. One family, the Goldsmiths, owned Home House. Others lived west of Edgware Road in the great houses of Connaught Square and Bayswater. They were wealthy, established, had seen Jews acquiring rights to do most things, notably with Lionel de Rothschild becoming the first Jewish MP in 1858. Now, he was not a member here, great mistake on his part. And Sir Francis Goldsmith, who indeed was a member, becoming the first Jewish barrister and indeed the first Jewish QC. He was the son of Sir Isaac Lyon Goldsmith, the key founder of University College London, and the first Jew to receive a hereditary title. Now, he wasn't a founder, he eventually joined West London, and you'll be glad to know, having originally intended to leave a lot of money to the Great Synagogue in the East End, he left it instead to West London Synagogue. 3 of our founder women members, and this is quite interesting, all connected to Sir Isaac Lyon Goldsmith, were members of what was known as the Langham Place Group, which was a sort of women's club, like a gentleman's club, but for women, back in the 1850s and 1860s, which campaigned for women to get a university education. So it was by no means all about material success. Being the Goder Peretz meant something to our founders. Our early members, Macatas, Goldsmiths, Samudas, Henriquez's, Levisons, had other causes beyond the immediate reasons we were founded, which was to establish decorum in services and to shorten the distance to be walked on Shabbat. The Reverend D.W. Marks, our first minister, was clear. Yes, of course, to decorum, and certainly to infinitely shorter services. They got the Friday night service down to 10 minutes. We could learn a lot from them. But if you read his early sermons, he's passionate about what we now call social issues. Amongst those was the education of girls, about which he preached at the synagogue's consecration, and members of this congregation were key figures in the establishment of the Girls' Public Day School Trust, responsible for educating a lot of the women around here, I have to say. And those schools were non-denominational because our founders insisted on that. But it wasn't just girls' and women's education either. Joseph Samuda, a founder member of the shipbuilders in Cubit Town, started building housing for his employees after a terrible explosion killed his brother, Jacob, and 9 employees. Now, if you go down to Cubit Town, and I do recommend it, by the way, you can see the Samuda estate, part of One Housing's properties, and if you go to the Cross Ness pumping station, you can see Joseph Samuda's name at the entrance, whilst its interior, bizarrely, somewhat resembles this building. Meanwhile, the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company Limited was founded in 1885 by Anglo-Jewish philanthropists, including several West London Synagogue members. The United Synagogue had undertaken a survey, the East End Commission in the early 1880s, at the behest of Chief Rabbi-elect Herman Adler, who was a vice president of the Mansion House Association for Improving the Dwellings of the Poor, amongst other things that he did on a national level. He was completely passionate about this. He convinced the wealthier Jews around London, Reform and Orthodox alike, to join him. Franklins, Mercators, Raphaels, Montefiores, Rothschilds and Lewisons were all amongst the original founders. Some of them were our members, and some, of course, still are. You can still see buildings and streets in the East End named after our founder members, Mercator Buildings and Henrica Street, to name but 2. To add to that, West London, despite its somewhat establishment reputation, ran clubs for disadvantaged boys and girls in the East End, ran clubs for refugees throughout World War II and before, and that's not forgetting Lingfield, the house owned by our member Sir Benjamin Drage, handed over as a home for children who'd survived the concentration camps in 1945, with the money that would have funded repairing this dome above us, so plain as you see, in its original ornate style after bombing, used instead to support those fragile, damaged children. But housing came back as a major issue, as did asylum seekers and refugees. And we've set a lead in the work we do with asylum seekers in our drop-ins and our outreach. What then of another major issue on our doorsteps, an issue we have a history of playing a role in, but which we have forsaken for many years: homelessness. We closed down the West Lawn Housing Association many years ago. We were too small, the real need had diminished, and specialised supported housing had grown ever more complex. But what if we were to take a different role, picking up where our founders left off and reimagining what might be done? Last month, London councils, a cross-party body, published an estimate of nearly 170,000 people in London living in hostels, bedsits, or other temporary accommodation. Up 10% in a year, that figure includes more than 83,000 children. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Many more people in London are homeless and sofa surfing, or indeed sleeping rough. And we see them on the street every day, more or less desperate. But shamefully, we don't really see them, and we rarely stop and chat. And just for an example, as I walked from the bus to here for the tot service, at which my grandson was the one who said it looked like Christmas. But as I walked, and that must be all of, 300 yards, there were 2 homeless people one in the doorway of the Barista just down the road from here, and one slightly further down outside one of the shops on Great Cumberland Place, both of whom were Eritrean, both of whom had just been given status as refugees, and both of whom had absolutely nowhere to live. I think it's a real issue because those people are more or less desperate, and we don't really see them, and we all too rarely stop and chat. Yet this crisis, as London councils of all shades of political opinion have said, is becoming increasingly unmanageable, with people earning up to £30,000 a year too poor for affordable housing schemes, and then there are skyrocketing numbers of families stuck in bed and breakfasts, with local councils having no other options for keeping a roof over those families' heads. So what could we do? Well, I'm no expert, but there must be something. We're usually quite inventive in this congregation, and we've got some form in this arena. We have local councillors, council leaders, politicians of various shades of opinion, mental health outreach workers, and more amongst us. The Prince of Wales is determined to do something about homelessness. Good for him. Couldn't we perhaps help him a bit? Could we volunteer for outreach, for looking after children when families have too little room? A drop-in, for instance, for bed and breakfast housed families, a bit like our drop-ins for asylum seekers. For some years, we ran a winter night shelter very successfully with 6 local churches on a Saturday night to give some temporary relief. Post-COVID, Westminster Council is very loath to continue that. Maybe we should challenge them. We've got councillors of both main parties in this community. Those stuck in single rooms and bed and breakfasts might need special social support, which, with some ingenuity, we might be able to provide. To add to that, Council's data is showing early indications of a significant increase in new rough sleepers, whose last accommodation before rough sleeping was asylum support housing. This links with our well-established drop-in. Those numbers are expected to rise exponentially. The Home Office is pushing to settle people's asylum claims, which is a good thing, but practice has changed, meaning that people are only getting 7 days to find somewhere else to live, and that's when we have a housing crisis. Refugees at home, strongly linked to West London Synagogue, thanks to Sarah Nathan, can help, but will be overwhelmed if this continues. We need to find at least some temporary solutions to homelessness, to loneliness for those who are rehoused, and some kind of help for the mentally ill people on our streets. We've got plenty of people in this congregation involved in voluntary organisations, involved in property, estate agencies, and more. Commercial office property is a drug on the market. Is it really beyond our ingenuity to do something to try and find some answers, even if only partial answers, even if only temporary answers, to London's housing crisis and the suffering it brings? We can't solve the problem, but we might be able to help, and we might even set a lead for voluntary activity. We made a huge difference with the local churches to street homelessness before COVID. Couldn't we try and do that now? I know that Nick Schlagman, our social action coordinator, would love to work with anyone here who might be interested in volunteering and helping design a programme for West London Synagogue. He thinks there's urgency here. It's pretty terrible out there. We know that our founders were deeply involved in this. Southern Housing Association, now one of the largest social housing providers, was originally the creation of the fabulously wealthy Samuel Lewis, who left £670,000 in 1901 to set up housing for the poor. That's 30 million in today's money. The most fashionable financier, or would you call him a moneylender of his day, nearly every noble family in Great Britain was said to have dealings with him. He left a huge fortune, and 5 million of it went to charity on the death of his widow, Ada Davis Lewis, who was quite a character in her own right. She became one of the 2 wealthiest women in the United Kingdom, and also famously a noted guest at the coronation of Edward VII, though several noble families objected to sitting near her. They were told not to bother to attend if that was their view. Oh, and in case you were wondering, they lived in Grosvenor Square, were West London Synagogue members, and are buried in our cemetery in Hoop Lane. Now, we probably can't match 30 million. That's really quite a big ask. But London's streets are full of homeless people, people with mental health issues, with people who are ex-army squaddies, asylum seekers, refugees, low earners, and people for one reason or another down on their luck. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them. Could we not, should we not, offer a helping hand? Involve ourselves in some kind of supported housing, with the experts maybe, with local councils almost certainly, and help alleviate the problem. For children, homelessness means disrupted education, lack of play facilities, fraught and troubled parents, a lack of family connections at the very least. Couldn't we help? And would that not be a first step in being the repairers of the breach, helping with others to alleviate a major problem, using our wealth, our skills, our knowledge, our connections to reach out to those we barely see when we walk past them, but whose situation we could improve? Would that not be a fitting way of observing this fast, this day that commands us to look at our inner selves, but also at the world around us? Could we not do that in the name of our founders who saw the problem and acted, and in the name of our future, so that suffering is much diminished? Would that not be a fitting end to this Yom Kippur? I think it might be. Kei Nihi Ratzon, may this be God's will.